Good day, people. So we're here to move on from basic control of planes and to look at mixed control of planes. We're just going to have a very brief discussion. So as far as basic control of planes, we've talked about creating anterior to posterior, posterior to anterior force on the midline in order to engage this motion in the sagittal plane, force straight across the body to engage the transverse plane, the coronal plane, force straight across the body to engage the coronal plane, and then an AP or PA force off of midline to engage motion in the transverse plane. So that's the basic control of planes. So what we really want to just have a very brief talk about is before you try to work in two planes at the same time, you want to make sure that you can control one plane at a time in any position, be it seated, supine, lateral, or prone. Now, the demonstration that's provided is essentially going to be in seated just so it's easily visualized, but all of these same things essentially apply in all positions. And obviously there will be caveats and times where this will change. But the big thing that I want to drive home before we go ahead and work on demonstrating mixed control of planes or controlling two or more planes at a time is that you need to first control one plane at a time. Then, if you want to engage two planes, engage one plane and then engage the other. That's the easiest way to begin it. Until such a point as you can control those well and safely and accurately, you won't want to mix planes immediately. But once you've got those basics, once you've kind of moved through those steps, and I know you're going to want to jump those steps, I know you're going to want to shortcut it. It's not an ideal thing to do, and of course you can try it and see what works. I'm not against that. Nobody should be, but if I was to suggest something, I would suggest basic practice. Practice controlling one plane accurately at a time, then one plane followed by another, then followed by another, and then eventually you'll be able to engage two planes at a time simultaneously. So we're just going to move on from this brief discussion and we're going to look at mixed control of planes or controlling more than one plane at a time. So here we are moving on with respect to control of planes. So we've talked in the previous video about control of a single plane at a time, or the basic concepts of control one plane at a time. Okay, so we understand that an anterior to posterior force, or rather a posterior to anterior force, or an anterior to posterior force, because I'm behind the patient, on the midline will, in a relative sense, engage the sagittal plane of motion. And the same anterior to posterior, or posterior to anterior force, right, so just straight from the front to the back, or the back to the front, will engage the transverse plane, or what is generally termed rotation. A force straight across the body line will engage the coronal plane. Now, if we go ahead and look at this concept of controlling more than one plane at a time, we have to understand that the first thing we need to do is have a good understanding and capacity to control one plane. We don't want to control two planes at a time, or for that matter, attempt to control three, until we create a situation whereby we're capable of controlling one plane safely at a time. Okay? So if we take the concept of an anterior to posterior force, or posterior to anterior force, off of midline to engage the transverse plane, and a force straight across the body to engage the coronal plane, what we might get is a hold, and we'll talk about all of this as we go on over time, about how to create holds that will, in a useful fashion, engage multiple planes. Right? I can go, if I was just here, right, just straight on top of the shoulder, I can easily engage the coronal plane. Okay, so I can push straight across the body wall, and I can make him bend away from me, or I can push straight down, and that's something we haven't talked about clearly, but we will over time. This is another way to engage the coronal plane. Now, if I have body contact with my patient, I can essentially push, although I'm oblique, I can essentially push straight across and create side bending, or create motion in the coronal plane. Now, if I put my arm on top, I push across, okay, that changes it. I can bend him to my side, right? So these are just multiple things. They're kind of things that we don't need to talk about in depth here. But I'm just showing a way to control the coronal plane. This position will allow me to control the coronal plane. Now, if I go ahead and I hook my elbow around, now I can create a anterior to posterior force and engage the transverse plane. So I have this setup, and this is what we'll talk about over time further in the future about how to create these setups to engage multiple planes. But here I can work on, this is an exercise that you can work on, is essentially push your abdomen into the patient to start to move them in the coronal plane. Push your arm down in a relative sense. Okay, so you can engage the coronal plane here. So although he's essentially drifting away, he's bending to this side. Okay, So that's one thing, that's engaging one plane, and then what I would do is I would engage the next plane, okay? So I can rotate as well. And because I have body contact, I can do all of this with relatively little effort. So this is just one example of how to engage two planes at a time. So I can engage the coronal plane and the transverse plane based on my hold. Another example just for visualization and how I would want somebody to begin learning how to do this is go one plane at a time, followed by the next plane. Okay, so I'm just going to get you to give yourself a hug. Okay, so as he gives himself a hug, what we can do is I can reach across and I can create rotation. Okay, so this isn't the perfect example of posterior to anterior force or anterior to posterior force, but it is a way to create that setup, so I can do that. Now, if I wanted to engage the sagittal plane as well, I can come underneath. I can do something like this. This is not ideal, but it's a way to do it. Okay, so I can lift up and push my abdomen into the patient, creating extension, and I can create rotation. Okay, but what I would want to do to make it clean is I would want to do one plane, so the sagittal plane, and then the transverse plane. Now, if I wanted to do this at the same time, it would look and pay attention to what is necessary. It would end up looking something like this because I'm searching for what the patient requires. Okay, so I can do them at the same time, but before I end up doing them at the same time, I would want to learn how to do one plane followed by the other plane. So that's the basic concept here. Learn how to control your basic control of your planes one at a time. Then when you want to learn how to mix them, do one plane followed by the other plane depending on what you're trying to do, whether it is sagittal and coronal, coronal and transverse, sagittal and transverse, what have you. You want to do one plane at a time, add the other plane in after, and once you've got that, then you can go to the example that we just showed.